Okay, let's get started. Welcome to CS 294-112, Deep Reinforcement Learning. So for today's lecture, we're going to go over some basic course logistics, and then each of the course instructors will give sort of a 20-minute talk about kind of what each of us finds exciting about deep reinforcement learning and motivate some of the material that you'll see later on in the course. But before we get into that, let's do some logistics and some introductions. So this semester, we're going to have 3 co-instructors in this class. Chelsea Finn, who is a PhD student in EECS, John Schulman, who's a research scientist at OpenAI, and myself, I'm a professor in EECS, actually just starting this year. All right, and each of us will teach some portion of the lectures, and each of us will hold office hours after our lecture, after class. So a little bit of course information. So there's the course website. Please do check out the course website. We have lots of useful information on there, including how to sign up for Piazza, which you should all do. For those of you that are not enrolled in the class but are following the class online, the videos will be on YouTube, so if you're following it online, that's probably what you're watching. And for you, we have a subreddit that we made, so we'd ask that only enrolled students actually sign up for the Piazza discussion. But for those of you that are not enrolled, you're welcome to check out the subreddit and have discussions there. We're going to have office hours after class, each lecture except for this one, and except for the invited speaker lectures. So during invited speakers, there's no office hours, but after normal lectures, we'll have office hours immediately afterwards, and the location for that will be posted on the course website. It'll be, Chelsea, is it in this building or in SDH?
Wednesday is Newton Room.
Okay. So Mondays in this building on the 4th floor, and Wednesdays it'll be across the street in Sotar Jadai, upstairs on the 7th floor. And that'll be on the course website. And the lecturer who's giving the lecture will also hold the office hours that day. So that's, also for the office hours, we do ask you guys to sign up in advance, to just put down your name, because if nobody signs up, then obviously we don't want to go and sit in an empty room. But do sign up. You can make sure that you reserve a slot so that if there's lots of people who sign up, you actually do get a chance to ask your questions. And we ask that because this is kind of a large class, and there's not a lot of teaching staff for a class this large, so please do sign up if you want to come to office hours. Okay, prerequisites. So hopefully all of you are aware of this. We do ask all enrolled students to have taken either CS 189, CS 289, or 281A. And if you are a PhD student and you took sort of an equivalent class in undergrad, that's fine. If you're not quite sure, or you think maybe it's sufficient but maybe not quite, do come ask me. We don't consider things like the Coursera machine learning course to meet the prerequisite, but if you took sort of a graduate level or advanced undergraduate level machine learning course, that counts. And if you're not sure, just come ask me. That's totally fine. Please enroll for 3 units by default. If you want to enroll for a different number of units, again, come ask me. You can enroll in less, but the class will be exactly the same. So it's exactly the same requirements for everybody, and we expect the default to be 3 units. The wait list is very, very full for this class, so it's a 70-person class, limited by the size of this room. The wait list has about double that. Unfortunately, if you haven't enrolled yet and you're not on the wait list, then probably you would have to take the class in a subsequent year. But those of you near the top of the wait list have been notified, and if some people drop, then if you're near the top, you'll be given an enrollment code. And lectures will be recorded. So since the class is full, we would ask that anybody who is not enrolled in the class to watch the lectures online, because we want to make sure that there's enough seats in the room for all the enrolled students to be able to come to class and participate, because participation is part of your grade. So please do come to class, ask questions, and engage with the lectures. All right. What you should know. So there's sort of the formal prerequisites. We want you to have taken 189 or an equivalent class. Assignments will require you to, unsurprisingly, train deep neural networks. And it's a good idea to be familiar with standard automatic differentiation tools for deep learning. You may use TensorFlow or Theano. I think by default, we'll sort of go with TensorFlow, but it should be possible to do the assignments in Theano as well. If you are not familiar with either TensorFlow or Theano, or feel like maybe you're a little rusty on that, or would like a bit of a refresher, we will kind of on demand, we will do a review section in week 2. Chelsea Finn will conduct that. But since we don't know how many of you want to come or what your backgrounds necessarily are, please do fill out that form. The link is also on the course website, so you don't have to write it down. But fill out that form. Tell us when you're available to do the section, if you want to do a section. And kind of a good rule of thumb is if you're not sure sort of if your background is strong enough, check out the TensorFlow MNIST tutorial. If you check out the TensorFlow MNIST tutorial and it's like super easy for you and you breeze right through it, then you're good. And if you feel like it's something that you're not completely comfortable with, then do come to the review section. And we'll get you right on track. Okay, so what will we cover in this class? So the full syllabus for this course is on the course website. And we're going to have sort of 5 main units in the class. It's a full semester length class. Last year we had a kind of a shorter version of this. This year it's a full length. And we'll really sort of cover deep reinforcement learning in the broadest sense. Basically, the many ways in which deep learning interacts with sequential decision making. So we'll begin with a relatively kind of gentle introduction where we'll talk about how supervised learning relates to decision making with things like imitation learning and behavior cloning. So we'll discuss that in the first unit next week and a little bit the week after that. And we'll also talk about model learning, models of system dynamics and using those for decision making. Then we'll have a unit on basic reinforcement learning methods. So we'll talk about Q-learning, policy gradients, make sure you get all the math in place to really understand the core reinforcement learning algorithms. Then we'll switch gears again and have a unit on advanced model learning and imitation learning with things like learning to predict images, policy distillation, learning reward functions for demonstration, things like that. Then we'll switch back to core reinforcement learning algorithms, and we'll talk about advanced deep RL algorithms, things like policy gradient methods with trust regions, actor-critic algorithms. We'll cover deep Q networks and so on, and there will also be an assignment both on advanced policy gradient algorithms and on deep Q networks. And then in the last sort of third of the class, when most of you are going to be working on your final projects, we'll have open problems, research talks, and invited lectures. And the purpose of that will really be to get all of you really familiar with sort of what is the state of the art now, what are the limitations, what are the big frontier questions, and really that should get you ready to think hard about the most important problems in this field, hopefully. And we also have an excellent slate of invited speakers lined up, and we'll probably be inviting 1 or 2 more. Okay, assignments. So we'll have 4 homeworks in this class. The homeworks will not be very large, so they shouldn't be too onerous. And then we'll have a final project, which is meant to be kind of a larger assignment. So the first homework will cover imitation learning. So we'll give you a little pre-trained policy, which will be sort of a substitute for a human demonstrator, and your job will be to experiment with some imitation learning algorithms to imitate that policy. Then we'll have an assignment on sort of basic reinforcement learning algorithms, kind of the core algorithms, which will not be deep reinforcement learning, but just shallow reinforcement learning to get you familiar with the algorithms. We'll have an assignment on deep Q learning, and then we'll have an assignment on policy gradients with neural network policies. So those will really get you some hands-on experience with kind of modern deep RL methods. And then we'll have a final project. So the final project, the expectation here is that this is sort of a research level project on a topic of your choice. You may form a group for this project of 2 to 3 students. You can also work by yourself if you'd like. We'll sort of adjust the expectations accordingly. There will be a final presentation and a final project report at the end. And you are more than welcome to start on the project early. So if you have some idea of the project you want to do, or you have some idea of the group that you want to work with, by all means do get started early. If you're not sure about the topic, just contact the course staff. We'll also have a list of prospective topics that can get you thinking about this stuff posted on the course website shortly. But you're also welcome to come up with something of your own. And we're generally fairly open-ended about the kind of projects you want to work on. They should have something to do with deep learning and decision-making, but we expect to be reasonably flexible on that. So if you're not sure if your topic fits, just let us know, and we can chat about it. Grades, most of the grade is going to be based on the final project. Each of the other homeworks is worth 10% of your grade for a total of 40%. And then if you are an enrolled student, we do expect you to come to class. You're welcome to watch the lectures and online and get a review of it, but we do expect you to come to class, and we'll have a little participation grade. So please do show up and make sure that you get that participation grade. For those of you that are standing in the back, there are a couple of seats here in the middle, although probably not enough for all of you. Yeah, hopefully in later classes, please do make sure that if you come to class, you are in fact an enrolled student. Okay, so as I said, the main purpose of today's lecture will be for each of the course instructors to give a little introduction with their own perspectives on DeepRL. And that's what we'll do next. But if any of you have any questions about course logistics, assignments, or anything like that, if you have a quick question, you're welcome to ask that now. Okay, yes? The number of units should be 3. You may enroll for less if you'd like, but it will not affect any of the assignments or our expectations. So if you have some technical reason to enroll for less, that's fine, but the same expectations for everyone. Okay, so let me get started with sort of my 20-minute pitch, and then we'll switch to the next instructor. So my portion of it will be a little bit high level, but then Chelsea and John will hopefully delve more into some of the details. So here's sort of my high-level pitch of this. In my work, I'm very concerned with how we build intelligent machines. And we can kind of go through this interesting thought exercise and ask ourselves, well, how could we build intelligent machines? One way that we can get started on building intelligent machines is we can think about, well, we have all these intelligent people, and we can try to figure out what is it that makes people able to have this kind of really flexible and adaptable intelligence, and how can we replicate that in machines? So if you want to build an intelligent machine, where would you start? Well, you can look at a person, you can look at a person's brain and say that, well, a person's brain can do all these different things. They have some part of their brain that does motor control, some part that processes visual images, some part that processes smells. We can kind of dig down into each of these, try to analyze what goes in, what comes out, what are some of the mistakes that module makes, try to guess something about its function, and then write down a piece of code that we believe does something qualitatively similar. And this is, in very broad terms, this is essentially what a lot of our artificial intelligence is concerned with. And, this kind of view of the brain as a collection of connected modules, I mean, I sort of intentionally chose a somewhat facetious picture here. You can break up the system, the incredibly complex system, in many, many different ways. Some of those ways make sense, some of them make less sense. In the early days of the scientific method, so to speak, some of the ways that people thought about the brain didn't entirely make sense. Now we have much more sophisticated views of this. And even with the best of our current technology, we can still somewhat break things up into these interconnected modules and say a few hopefully reasonably accurate things about what each of those modules does. But it gets really, really complicated, especially if you want to construct a theory that has some bearing on reality. So, the phrenology theory there on the left presumably has relatively little bearing on reality. Our modern view of neuroscience hopefully is much, much more accurate, but it's still dizzyingly complex when it comes to trying to think through how each of those components could be implemented in code in a computer. So what if instead of trying to implement each of these things, actually program each of them yourself, what if we had an adaptive learning-based method? And there's, I think, a reasonable argument to be made that learning can be viewed as the basis of intelligence, because while there are some things that we can all do, perhaps due to our natural aptitude, for example, basic motor control, there's an argument to be made that some animals kind of basically come pre-programmed with some basic motor control like walking, especially if they can walk immediately after being born. Like horses, humans can't do that, but it's probably reasonable to say that humans have some innate aptitudes towards things like recognizing faces that are exaggerated beyond what they would get through learning alone. But there are also some things that we can do that are clearly not things that we could possibly be pre-programmed for, that are clearly the result of learning, like operating a car, which is not something that we could have possibly evolved to do. So clearly learning is a very big component of our intelligence. And we can learn a very huge variety of things, including very, very difficult things. So with a little bit of a leap of faith, we can make the argument that, well, perhaps our learning mechanism is so powerful that even if we do have some things that are innate, perhaps that's sort of not the strict minimum necessity for some degree of intelligence. That if once you have a sufficiently powerful learning machine, then it can learn everything it needs to behave intelligently and adaptively. So so therefore, the learning mechanism is powerful enough, and if we can just figure out the right learning mechanism, we could have that power without having to manually program each of these modules and figure out how they're wired together. This is sort of the, the high-level hypothesis. Of course, it may in practice be very convenient to hard code a few basic things, for example, to get the process bootstrapped. But the big challenge might just be to get the right learning mechanism. So then there's another hypothesis that kind of arises from this, that if learning is the basis of intelligence, which may or may not be, but hopefully I've made somewhat of an argument to that effect. If that is the basis of intelligence, then is it the case that you need sort of different learning mechanisms for each of the individual modules? So have we actually won ourselves anything, or have we simply replaced the problem of building a bunch of modules manually with the problem of building a bunch of learning algorithms manually? That's a good question, a fairly deep one. And it may be that it's sort of bad news, and the learning mechanism you need to learn how to see is completely different from the learning mechanism you need to learn how to move, which is different from the one that you need to learn how to smell, and so on. And then we perhaps won ourselves a little bit. Maybe building those learning algorithms is easier than building the individual modules, but we're still kind of in this really painful systems building problem. But perhaps that's not the case. Perhaps it's enough to build one or a small number of very flexible algorithms that can then accomplish the job of actually building each of these modules. And there is actually a little bit of evidence that suggests that perhaps this is the case. So I'll show you a few pieces of evidence here. These are somewhat shamelessly borrowed from some slides by Andrew Ng, who gave an excellent talk on this topic a few years back, with a few examples of learned behaviors in humans that seem to suggest an extremely high degree of adaptability, at least when it comes to processing sensory information. So this picture here is a little device that consists of a camera attached to an electrode array that you can put on your tongue. And the individual nodes on this array will send a little electrical impulse based on what the camera is seeing. And it turns out that you could actually do a test on a human subject to test their visual acuity when their eyes are covered or closed, or if they're blind, and show that indeed using this little tongue-based electrode array with signals coming from the camera, they have some degree of visual acuity, which essentially means that you can learn to see with your tongue. Now, clearly the tongue was never designed for this, and I'm at least not aware of any animals in nature that see with their tongue, but people can figure that out, and that suggests a very, very high degree of adaptability, in this case in the somatosensory cortex, that perhaps is not easily explained with the modular view over here. People can learn to use sound and their voice to localize objects and obstacles. This is called echolocation. There are examples of echolocation in nature in animals like bats. People aren't sort of out of the box equipped to do that, but with enough practice and enough incentive, turns out that you can actually do a passable job of it. And perhaps one of the more compelling pieces of evidence for this degree of plasticity is the so-called ferret rewiring experiment. So this is a set of experiments that was conducted on ferrets, and I believe it's since been replicated on other animals as well, where the optic nerve was actually severed and reconnected to the auditory cortex in the brain. And after that, again, you can conduct some experiments, and you can test the animal's visual acuity, and it turns out that after an adaptation period, the animal can actually recover some degree of visual acuity, essentially by processing visual information using its auditory cortex. So that, again, suggests a very high degree of plasticity and adaptability. And in fact, anatomical studies sort of also suggest that at least the neocortex is sort of somewhat uniform throughout different parts of the brain. So that if you, at least at a coarse level, if you look at the composition of the auditory cortex or the visual cortex, there's not any gross anatomical differences that immediately jump out at you, which further supports this idea that perhaps there's sort of a single uniform substrate that's adaptable enough to process all of these different kinds of sensory information. Okay, so maybe this is not completely open and shut case, but some convincing evidence that a certain degree of plasticity is present, and perhaps there's a single adaptation mechanism that allows each of these components to adapt to process the information that they're receiving. So if we buy into this idea that perhaps a single algorithm can perform the job of all these different modules, or at least can train all these modules to perform their job, then we can ask ourselves the following question. if we'd like to design a single algorithm that can be the basis of learning-based intelligence, what does this algorithm need to be able to do? Can we at least write down some sort of bare minimum things that it needs to be able to do? Well, it needs to be able to interpret rich sensory signals. At least for us, our sensors are actually quite complex. They don't seem to be particularly optimized to produce low-dimensional inputs. So, our sense of touch is extremely high bandwidth. Our eyesight is unbelievably high bandwidth. And there are ways to compress this information, but for whatever reason, we don't do it. And the most obvious ways to endow our machines with senses like this also would be very high bandwidth, things like cameras, LiDAR, and so on. So it seems like being able to process rich, extremely high-dimensional sensor information is a crucial component of having this kind of learning-based intelligence. And then the other thing is that we need our intelligent machine to be able to choose complex actions. And here again, it's actually the same story, that there are ways to build actuation mechanisms that are extremely low-dimensional, that have a very small number of commands that give rise to complex behaviors. And that doesn't appear to be what's going on, at least with humans. With some animals, especially insects, that sometimes is the case. With humans, it's not. We have actually more muscles than we have degrees of freedom in our skeleton. The system is overcomplete, and somehow that doesn't seem to be bothering us very much. So it seems like we're able to deal with complex actions, with complex, very high-dimensional outputs just fine. So then we can kind of hypothesize that we need to be able to interpret rich sensory signals, and we need to be able to choose complex actions. So why is it kind of a good idea to look at deep reinforcement learning and related methods as one of the ways to get there? Well, the deep part refers, I guess, traditionally to training deep neural networks, but more generally large high-capacity models. That has proven to be a very effective way to process complex sensory input. So if you have to process complicated, very, very high-dimensional input that involves all these different complicated factors of variation all superimposed together, it seems that large high-capacity models like deep neural networks do a remarkably good job of that, probably better than any other mechanism that we know today. So it seems like a good idea to include that as one of the ingredients. And more generally, deep neural networks are very good at computing all sorts of really complex functions. So while we have very, very convincing evidence that they're well suited for dealing with high-dimensional sensory input, it seems reasonable to hypothesize that they might also be really good at dealing with very high-dimensional outputs and computing really complex functions. And why reinforcement learning? Well, the reason for that is that, as I mentioned before, we need to be able to choose complex actions. And deep learning by itself doesn't actually tell us much about how we can make decisions. It just tells us how we can build very expressive models. So the reinforcement learning part is there because that's what's going to give us, hopefully, the algorithmic tools to be able to reason about making decisions. And in some ways, sort of the deep and the reinforcement learning parts are two separate questions. Deep is about representation, and reinforcement learning is about algorithm. And it's not that we need any one particular reinforcement learning algorithm, although maybe we do, we just don't know about it yet. But it seems like we need something that can solve the reinforcement learning problem, the problem of choosing good actions in situations that don't give you dense supervision. And we'll define reinforcement learning more formally in subsequent lectures as well. Okay, so that's sort of the somewhat hand-wavy hypothesis. Now let's look at a little bit of work that maybe sheds a little bit of light on why these components, the deep learning and the reinforcement learning, are actually perhaps worth examining. So first, I'm going to briefly talk about this paper from Andrew Sachs and a few other students from Engineering's group. This is from 2011, that examines features, sensory features learned by deep neural networks, and compares them to the statistical properties of features observed in sensory cortices of animals and humans. So they have a number of experiments that they present in this work, and if you're interested in this topic, I actually strongly encourage you to read this paper and delve into this in more detail, but I'll just summarize some of the experiments very briefly at a very high level. So their experiments on visual data show a few really interesting things. One of the things that they did in this work is that they simulated the prismatic glasses experiment. So this is an experiment that traditionally was done on kittens, where kittens are reared with special glasses that actually distort what they're seeing so that the images that they see are essentially smeared vertically. So you can see an example of that in this top row. And what this experiment is meant to test is how do the visual features that are learned by the visual cortex of the cat, how are those visual features altered based on the kind of perceptual data that it receives in the critical phase of its life. And you can if you run this experiment, if you have a lab that works with kittens, you can find out that the sensitivity in the visual cortex to features with certain orientations unsurprisingly changes if all the things that the kitten sees in its life are things that are these vertical bars versus if it sees more natural images. So the statistical properties of the features change. In particular, their sensitivity to orientation of edges changes, which makes sense because if it only sees vertical edges, it presumably will not understand what horizontal edges do. But you can repeat the same experiment with deep neural networks. You can, in their case, they run an unsupervised learning algorithm on natural images and on images that have been distorted in this way, and they find that actually the gross statistical properties more or less line up with the ones that are observed in the kitten rearing experiments. They conduct an experiment sort of in a similar vein on auditory data, where they again look at sensitivity, in this case to frequencies, between auditory cortices in animals and a neural network trained on, I believe, speech data. The last experiment that I'm going to mention from this paper that I thought was actually really creative is an experiment to try to evaluate features for the sense of touch and compare that with what's observed in the somatosensory cortex. And for this experiment, the animal data actually comes from a macaque, where there's a device that actually, it looks a little bit like a drum with indentations on it. The macaque puts its hand on it, and then the drum basically touches the hand in different places. And they have an electrode in the monkey's brain, and that records basically the sensitivity to different tactile features. Yes?
Wouldn't you expect to see the same statistical change in any universal approximator?
Yes, and I'm going to get to that at the end of this slide. Yeah, that's a very good question. So with the touch experiment, there's this drum mechanism for getting the data from the macaque, which they didn't do in this paper. They actually just cite a previous work that does this. And then to train the deep network, deep networks aren't connected to human hands typically, so what they actually do instead is they get this funny blue glove, and they have a person handle an object that's been dusted with this white dust. And then once the person has touched the object, they put the glove on a piece of paper, record an image of it, and that gets them these kind of touch impressions. And then they train their unsupervised deep network on it, and again look at the statistical properties of the features that they learned. And again, the gross statistics agree. Of course, in the details, things are a little different. Now, it's interesting to think about these results a little bit because one conclusion you might draw from this, which is not the conclusion that's actually claimed in the paper, but one conclusion you might draw is that the particular algorithm that they use works like the brain. And that's not necessarily the right conclusion. I think, going back to the comment earlier, it's just as possible that, in fact, what's going on is that these sensory modalities have certain statistical properties, and a sufficiently powerful function approximator, whether it's a deep neural network or something else, can capture those statistics. That's still interesting because it means that whatever is being captured in the features in the brains of these animals sort of lines up with what we get using sufficiently powerful function approximators, but it doesn't necessarily tell us that we have to be using the particular kind of deep network that they use. And in fact, a little bit of kind of food for thought there is that, at least for the visual data, there are lots of algorithms that will produce features with high-level statistics that match up with the ones observed in the brain, including things like sparse coding and, if you're clever about it, even k-means. So the point is not so much that it has to be this particular deep neural network, but that it has to be large enough and have enough capacity to be able to capture the statistical properties that are actually in the data. And actually, at least in my lectures, when I talk about deep learning, what I really mean is things that have enough capacity, which might be deep networks. Deep networks happen to be a really good choice right now because we know how to train them well, but it may as well be something else if we have a good learning algorithm for it. Okay, so this is sort of maybe some evidence that deep learning, at least the way I've defined it, is a good choice if you want to process high bandwidth sensory data, and at least at a very high level, what's going on seems to line up with what we observe in primary sensory cortices. What about reinforcement learning? Well, with reinforcement learning, actually, the story is even better. So reinforcement learning, was actually originally proposed as a model for decision-making in animals, and only later made its way to computer science as an AI algorithm. And there's extensive literature on reinforcement learning in animals. This is a survey paper by Yale Niv that I would encourage you to read if you're interested in this question. There's extensive evidence that things like reinforcement learning do happen when animals learn behaviors. Just a few of the pieces of evidence for this include things like, if you have a percept that anticipates a reward, so if you have a monkey, let's say, that receives a little bit of juice, initially the monkey will, of course, associate that juice with reward, and you can record from neurons in its brain and see that, yes, there's some pattern that corresponds to the monkey being happy about its juice. But if you always precede the juice with some sort of visual cue, then eventually the monkey will sort of back up that reward to the visual cue, and you will observe the same signal when it's exposed to the visual cue, even if the juice doesn't actually follow later. So that is quite in line with what we'd expect from a kind of Bellman backup, which you'll learn about later in the course. And then there's even some anatomical studies that provide evidence, for example, that the basal ganglia might be at least partially responsible for the reward system that creates this kind of backup. So there's actually quite a bit of anatomical studies about where the reinforcement learning might actually be happening. And sort of the preponderance of evidence seems to suggest that model-free reinforcement learning, like adaptation, is often a good fit for the experimental data of animal adaptation to changes in their environment. But not always. And I'll get back to this point later when I talk about some of the limitations of our current understanding of deep RL. So what can deep learning and RL do well now? And my co-instructors will talk about this in a little bit more detail, but at a very high level, deep reinforcement learning right now is very good at acquiring a high degree of proficiency in domains that are governed by simple and known rules. So a few of the examples that you might already be aware of, things like AlphaGo or playing guitar games, quite complex domains where complex behavior is a consequence of relatively simple rules. So in AlphaGo, the rules of the game are well known and well understood, so we can simulate a large amount of experience from that system. And even though it gives rise to tremendous complexity, since the underlying generator is simple and known, you can generate all this experience. And the same broadly holds true for Atari games as well. DeepRL is quite good at learning simple skills with raw sensory inputs given enough experience. So this is an example from some research done at Carnegie Mellon that I'll hopefully discuss later on in the course, where a robot learned how to grasp objects by attempting many, many different grasps and then correlating the images that it saw with success or failure. So here, this method was very effective, but partly it was because the skill itself was relatively simple, and it's really the sensory input that's really complex. Some of the experiments that we did here at Berkeley, a lot of this was done by Chelsea Finn, involved training a robot to perform some manipulation skills. And here again, it's kind of the same story, that there's some complexity in the motor control, but a lot of what the deep learning is really doing really well is processing that sensory input, and then combining that with a little bit of reinforcement learning to get a little bit of motor control complexity. And then the other big success of deep reinforcement learning has been in in imitation learning. I'm using the term reinforcement learning here quite broadly, is in imitating human behavior. So if you get a very large amount of human demonstrations of, let's say, a person controlling a robot, a car, or a flying vehicle, you can actually do really well at trying to mimic that behavior. Again, processing raw images and raw sensory inputs, yes.
Going back to what you were saying earlier with intelligence, you talked about processing complex sensory inputs as well as actions. What about language?
Yeah, so in this section, I actually intentionally didn't get into language, partly because I don't know as much about it, but partly also because I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that at the stage where we're at now when it comes to building intelligent machines, there are animals that don't have language, but have substantially more capability than the best autonomous systems that we can build. So intelligence, it's not necessarily limited to humans, right? It's sort of tempting for us to think that we're really, really smart, and therefore the only thing we should look at is humans. But actually, I have no idea how to build a robot today that is as adaptable as a rat, for example. And it's not just because the rat is mechanically really, really cleverly built. It's because the rat is very smart and adaptable, but doesn't have language. So I think language is really interesting. I think that perhaps there are other things that are kind of more pressing challenges if we're particularly concerned about trying to find the most direct line to more intelligent systems. Okay, so what has proven challenging so far? So what are the things that are kind of perhaps badly lacking? Well, one of the things that humans can do, and animals as well, including the rat, is learn very, very quickly. So this is a picture of a little experimental setup that's quite popular in studying human motor control, where a person is asked to move this lever between 2 points, and there's a perturbation that is introduced. So this lever is actually powered, and it will push the person kind of off course, and the person has to adapt and compensate. And people can actually adapt and compensate for this very, very quickly, substantially more quickly than kind of conventional reinforcement learning algorithms would lead you to suggest. So deep reinforcement learning methods are usually slow. They usually require more experience than we typically observe as necessary for humans and animals. Humans are very, very good at reusing past knowledge. So we very rarely actually learn new things from scratch. We build on what we have before. We draw analogies to our past experience. And currently, this is not a very heavily studied problem. So this kind of transfer learning and deep reinforcement learning is still an open problem. And I would argue that even sort of the right problem formulation is not something that we've completely nailed down yet here. It's often not clear what the reward function should be. And this is something that I think Chelsea will talk about a little bit in her portion of the talk. And it's also not clear what the role of prediction should be. So I mentioned at the end of that slide on reinforcement learning that model-free adaptation often is a good explanation for behavior observed in animals, but not always. And it's because animals, and especially humans, don't always adapt in a model-free way. We use our ability to predict the future to adapt more quickly, and it's not yet clear in the world of reinforcement learning how this kind of model-based learning fits with the model-free learning, whether it's sort of a hard switch between the two, whether it's some combination of both, and even like how do we decide which one to use when. So that's still very much an open problem, and may in many ways be related to the first point about learning very quickly. But at a very high level, I think that the last thing I want to leave you with in this portion of the talk is that we can approach AI in a few different ways. We can approach AI from the standpoint of saying that, well, we have all these different things that we want our machine to do. We want to find out a way to do them. We want to implement those in code. And that's a very reasonable kind of system-building way to go about it. But perhaps what it might make sense for us to do is to try to distill the system down to its basic individual components and try to come up with algorithms that really are the simple parsimonious generators of the complex intelligent behavior that we want to see. And I will say in the end here that this is not by any means a new idea. So there's a quote that I like very much that I'd like to share with you here. Instead of trying to produce a program to simulate the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? If this were then subject to an appropriate course of education, one would obtain the adult brain. This was Alan Turing. All right, so I'll switch now to one of you guys. Maybe it makes sense for you to go first, John.
Sure, yeah. Are we going to give the students a break?
Yeah, maybe you guys want to take like a little 30-second break to get up and stretch your legs a little, and then
Okay.
while I switch with John here. The what? The what? The chair. Oh. Yeah, that you need to use that. Oh. And we'll leave this here for Chelsea. Mm-hmm.
Can I have everyone's attention? Do I need to press the?
You don't need to use that thing.
Okay.
So
This is recording. Okay.
Yeah. They're both recording.
Okay. Okay. Can I have everyone's attention? Thank you. So I'm John. I think was there an intro at the beginning of the class? Okay. I unfortunately.
We all know who you are.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm gonna. So Sergey gave a very nice, motivating, inspiring introduction with neuroscience and everything. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the formalism of reinforcement learning and what is reinforcement learning and what isn't reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning is concerned with taking sequences of actions. Usually, this is illustrated using an agent and an environment. Every time step, the agent emits an action, and the environment replies with an observation and a reward. And the observation is usually a high-dimensional quantity. The reward is a scalar, and the agent is trying to maximize the cumulative sum of rewards. This process can be formalized as a partially observable Markov decision process, which we're going to define more precisely later. POMDPs and MDPs are, in a way, the key mathematical objects in reinforcement learning. However, not everything we're going to talk about in this class is how to maximize rewards in POMDPs because, as Sergey pointed out, sometimes you don't have the reward function, for example, in imitation learning. So to be more inclusive, we might say that deep reinforcement learning will be about how to solve POMDPs and also some things that aren't POMDPs.
Which means it's going to solve everything.
Yeah, right. Let's just give a few examples of what the observations and rewards might be in different kinds of problems. So in robotics, your observations might be camera images and joint angles for the robot. Actions would be, for example, joint torques. And the rewards would depend on the precise problem that you're trying to solve, but it could be to stay balanced or navigate to some target locations or something more abstract like serve and protect humans. Another motivating application for reinforcement learning, which has been around for a while, is various decision-making problems in business operations. So one classic example is inventory management, where you have observations are your current inventory levels, actions are how many units of each item to purchase, and rewards are your profit. Reinforcement learning is also starting to be used a lot in other machine learning problems that don't look exactly like decision-making problems, but it turns out that it's natural to solve them that way. So one example is classification with so-called hard attention. So in normal image classification, you have an image, and you have to figure out if there's a cat in that image or a dog in that image. And maybe so the problem is, what if it's a really big image? It might not make sense to just take the whole image and pass it into your neural network. It might make more sense to solve it the way a human would solve it, which is you see a little thing in the corner of your eye, which might be a cat or a dog. Then you point your eye at the object and look at it in high resolution, and then you classify it as a cat or a dog. So if you want to do this kind of thing with a neural network, what you might do is you might want some kind of model that decides how to crop the image. So it looks at the image, then it figures out, I want to look at that corner of the image, and then it crops it there. And then outputs its classification choice. So in that case, your observation would be the current image window, action would be where to look next, and reward would be +1 if you classify it correctly, for example. This is also used in a lot of domains other than image classification. Another area is where you have to output some complex object with your neural network instead of just a classification decision like cat versus dog. So for example, in machine translation where you have to output a whole sentence translating from one language to another. So in this case, your observations would be words in the source language that you're translating from. The actions would be to emit words in the target language, and your rewards would be some kind of metric of how accurate your translation is, how good your translation is. So we're fortunate enough to have a guest lecturer, Mohammed Narouzi, who's going to talk about his work on this topic later in the course, using reinforcement learning ideas to help with machine translation. Okay, what is deep reinforcement learning? Sergey already gave some nice definitions of it in terms of representation learning. You can usually take the word deep and put it in front of any machine learning concept, and it means that at least one function is going to be approximated by a neural network. So the nice thing about reinforcement learning is you actually have a lot of creativity in where you're going to put your neural network, as opposed to some other fields where there's basically only one sensible choice. So there are basically at least three choices of where to put it. One place is you could try to approximate a policy, which is just a function that outputs actions as a function of your history of what the agent has seen so far. Another choice is to approximate a value function, which is a function that tells you how good a given state is, which states are good and which states are bad, or measures the goodness of a state-action pair. Or lastly, you could try to approximate a dynamics model, which is trying to approximate how the system is going to evolve over time. So for example, in robotics, you're trying to approximate physics to figure out where's the robot going to be 1 second later. So one natural question is, how does reinforcement learning relate to other machine learning problems? So in supervised learning, you're outputting a label to classify something as a cat or a dog. Isn't that also a decision? So isn't that also decision making? So the key thing, in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about what's the difference between reinforcement learning and supervised learning. So, don't dwell too much on the notation I'm using. I'm just trying to make them use the same variable names. So in supervised learning, the environment samples an input-output pair. X is your input, Y is your output from some distribution. The agent makes a prediction for what Y should be, what the output should be, and then receives a loss telling the agent if it's right or wrong. And also, the agent gets to see what the correct answer was. Or the agent gets to see what the loss function was. So to summarize, the environment asks the agent a question and then tells it the right answer. So the agent can try to adjust its answering process to be more correct. So there's an intermediate problem setting which is halfway between supervised learning and reinforcement learning called the contextual bandit setting. So in the contextual bandit setting, the environment samples an input. The agent takes an action based on that input, and then the agent receives some kind of cost, which is noisy, and it comes from some distribution depending on the input and the agent's action. And the agent doesn't know what this cost function is, so the only way it can improve its process is to interact with the environment a lot. So this setting is the environment asks the agent a question, and it gives the agent a noisy score on its answer, but it doesn't tell the agent what it should have output. So the agent might have to search over lots of different possible outputs, and the agent has to explore different possible outputs. So you get the exploration problem captured here. This has a lot of lucrative applications, like how to provide people with recommendations, you go to Amazon, and Amazon knows your shopping history, so it can decide to propose some item that you might want to buy. It'll say you might be interested in so-and-so. So here the contextual bandit problem would be they have your shopping history, that's the input, and then their action is to choose what to propose for you, what to advertise to you, and then the reward is whether or not you buy it. But they don't know what you really want to buy. That's hidden to the website. So that's something that has to be discovered through exploration with a lot of different people. And finally, reinforcement learning is a very similar setup, but now you have a stateful world. So now it's not just that now the input that the agent gets is not just randomly sampled independently each time step. Now it depends on the previous inputs and the agent's previous actions. So the environment has some state, and the input depends on your previous actions. And that makes the problem quite a bit harder, because now you if you change what the agent is doing, you start receiving different data. So it's like the input data to your agent changes as a function of what the agent is doing, and that makes it hard to come up with a stable algorithm. So here, the agent takes an action, and then it receives a cost function depending on the current state of the world and the action it took. So in this case, so just to summarize these three settings, there are really two big differences between supervised learning and reinforcement learning. The first one is you don't have access to the function, to the reward function or the function you're trying to optimize. You have to query the system through interaction. So that's like, this is the contextual bandit setting also has this property that you don't have analytic access to the loss function. You just have to interact with the system and use that for learning. And the other difference, which makes reinforcement learning different from contextual bandit, the contextual bandit setting, is you have a stateful world where it's history dependent. Okay, so deep reinforcement learning is a pretty hot topic right now, and it hasn't. This is the first time Berkeley has a full course offering on it, as far as I know. But actually, some of the idea of combining neural networks with control and with reinforcement learning is actually has been around for a while. So it's useful to be aware of the history, so we can so we can look back and say what did well, first of all, what were they missing, and what did they get right, and what were they missing, and also just to be give credit where it's due. I mean, using neural networks for control has been around since at least the 90s, and so this has been used in the control theory community a lot. There's even a book on neural networks for control. So this also combining neural networks with reinforcement learning algorithms like Q-learning has also been around for a while. I mean, you can see it in some of the in some of the older papers on reinforcement learning that the people working on that were also interested in neural networks. But actually, I particularly like this, reading this thesis, which is Longjin Lin's thesis from 1990 or 1993. And I'd say this is the first deep RL thesis written. And the funny thing about it is, when you read the abstract to it, you think, oh, that could have been written today, and it would have seemed like modern. And this is what the same questions people are thinking about now. So it's got like he's talking about combining reinforcement learning algorithms with neural networks to get better generalization. Experience replay, that's an idea that's become prominent again recently. Learning from demonstrations to speed up the process. And having some kind of hierarchy where you have like high-level actions as opposed to just low-level action, and so on. So that it just makes you think a little bit. So I would say the first really impressive result obtained using reinforcement learning and neural networks, at least for game playing, is TD gammon. So this was back in the early 90s. Jerry Tesoro used a neural network to play the game of backgammon, where this is a board game that's where you roll dice and you move these pieces around. And the algorithm he used ended up using a MLP, a multi-layer perceptron, to approximate the value function for backgammon. And he learned this by having the neural network play against itself lots of times. And it ended up getting up to the level of experts using this pretty simple RL algorithm. And eventually he was able to beat the top human experts by adding a little more hand engineering. So this was a really big breakthrough on the games front. And there's been also a lot of recent work with games using deep learning and reinforcement learning. So Atari has become a test bed, and a really popular test bed, and that got people really excited about the field a few years ago when results came out from Vladimir and collaborators showing that you could learn to play a lot of Atari games with this algorithm called Q-learning plus their modifications. And more recently, people have applied different kinds of algorithms, policy gradient algorithms, that's another kind of RL algorithm, and Dagger, which is a sort of imitation learning algorithm. You guys are going to implement all of these in the class. And there's also been some success in the robotics domain. So here are my two co-teachers in an awesome picture, along with our advisor, Peter Beal, using guided policy search. That's an algorithm that we'll learn about later in the class to learn robotic manipulation behaviors really fast. And there's also been some work on learning robotic locomotion controllers using policy gradient algorithms. And maybe the recent result that got the most press is AlphaGo back last year, where this team from DeepMind was able to get a program to beat the world champion, the Go world champion, or one of the top players in the world at Go. This approach actually combined a lot of different ideas. It wasn't just like one algorithm, one simple algorithm that was applied at large scale. There was sort of a grab bag of different tools, many of which we'll learn about in the class. So they use supervised learning, where you train from tons of expert games to try to predict what the experts are going to do. That's just learning a classifier that maps from the board state to the 361 outputs of which move you're going to take. So that's the supervised learning part. Policy gradients, that's another kind of RL algorithm we're going to learn about. Value functions, and also Monte Carlo tree search, which is that's a more classic technique that goes and searches all the possible moves from either player. All right, that's all for my slides. Chelsea? Oh, here's the mic.
Okay, so John talked a lot about reinforcement learning and a lot of the powerful framework of learning from reward functions and learning from learning in sequence. And what I'm going to be talking about is how we can go beyond that, because reward functions, I guess I'll start with saying, here's an example of an Atari playing agent that John mentioned earlier, where the agent has learned how to play the game of Breakout. And the way that it learns this game is by looking at the score, where the score is the reward function. But in many real-life scenarios, for example here, it's unclear what the reward function would be. So in Atari, every time you hit a block, you get some feedback saying you're doing well at the task and you should improve and continue to do tasks that will give you those rewards. But in this scenario, you don't really have an example of you don't have this sort of detailed reward feedback of the agent basically getting feedback as it's learning how to do the task. It just pours a cup of water, and then maybe it has some sense of internal reward once the child finally ends up drinking the water. So in this scenario, what is the reward function? And in general, in the real world, humans don't get a score. And so it's clear that plain reinforcement learning from rewards isn't the answer for a general algorithm for intelligence. So what else can we do? So as John mentioned, there's a lot of successes in reinforcement learning that including backgammon, Atari, AlphaGo, as well as locomotion. And one theme that you might notice in all of these tasks is that there is a very clear notion of what the reward function might be, like the score of the game, whether or not the game was won at the end, or forward progress in locomotion. But in many real-world domains, the reward function is actually going to be quite difficult to specify. For example, in this task before, the reward function, if you wanted to formulate this as a reinforcement learning problem, what you might have to do is then design some detector that takes in an input of the image and tries to tell how much water is in the cup, and then given that detector, then determines a score based on how much water was in the cup versus how much water isn't in the cup or may have spilled onto the floor. And engineering that sort of reward function kind of defeats the whole purpose of learning. This isn't just true in robotic manipulation. It might and learning to pour water in a cup. It's also true in many other scenarios, like autonomous driving, dialogue systems, virtual assistants, and others as well, where you don't have this very clear-cut reward function. You may have some reward function, like at the end of your task, it's clear that you succeeded versus you didn't succeed, but you clearly need much more than that in order to be able to learn how to successfully perform what you want to perform. So what other forms of supervision or information can we learn from? So one that both Sergey and John touched on is you can learn from demonstrated behavior. For example, through imitation or inferring the intention of the desired behavior to try and accomplish that behavior. Another form of information is self-supervision or prediction. So as you're acting in the world, you're constantly getting feedback on what's happening as a consequence of your actions. And this in itself can be a form of supervision because you can try and predict what's going to happen if you take different actions. And lastly, you can also combine these sorts of learning algorithms with other objectives and additional sensing modalities to try and predict things that might be relevant to the task. So I'm going to talk about each of these in sequence, and then we'll end the lecture. So first, learning from demonstrated behavior. So it's very clear that this is something that humans do. So starting at as early as 8 months, we see that humans imitate very simple actions and expressions from adults that they see in the environment. And at 18 months, infants will imitate after a delay and will imitate multi-step actions. And after 36 months, infants will imitate multi-step actions after a delay. And for example, in this paper, they showed that actually 14-month infants, after a week of delay, so the way that the experiment was set up is that they brought the infants in and showed them an object and showed a human manipulating that object in a way that they would have never seen in the real world. And then they brought the infants back a week later and presented them with that object and observed that very frequently the infants would imitate and would do what they saw a week prior with that object when they were presented with the object. So this is a very clear signal that that imitation is a big part of learning as children are learning, even after a delay and even after they haven't been around that demonstration in a while. And so one of the ways that imitation has been applied in AI is for autonomous driving. So here is the result of a paper from NVIDIA on learning how to basically follow a lane. And it was able to, this is the car in the video is the car that is driving autonomously through imitation. And the top right shows the vehicle's camera. And it's through an algorithm that you'll learn about in this class. Basically through straight imitation of human behavior is able to learn how to drive in a variety of conditions, such as rain, as I showed before, as well as in snow. And despite how basic the algorithm is, just trying to imitate the actions that the human drivers take, it's quite impressive what the car is able to do. Yeah.
Is there like a way to like evaluate how good like an imitation learning algorithm is? Because there's no really reward involved. So like, how do we know like whether it's doing like having a good imitation or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was how do we evaluate these sorts of systems that are learning via imitation or learning from demonstrations in general? And this is a challenge in a lot of problems where you're not learning from reward. Because if you're learning from reward, a lot of the ways the main way that you evaluate it is how high of a reward can you get. In this situation, it's less clear-cut, and usually the ways for evaluating it are task-specific or domain-specific. For example, in this case, you may, a common way to evaluate driving systems and mobile robotics is the operation time without crashing, the number of times a human has to take over for a sequence, and also, if it's a non-driving task, you might have a specific task that you set up that you're trying to imitate, that you're trying to learn, and the success rate is how you measure it. But a lot of those are pretty manual processes. You can also define a reward function for this task and set it up as an MDP where you have demonstrated behavior and then evaluate reward, but then you have to set up a reward function, and then why not learn from the reward function in the first place? Okay, and beyond imitation, it's also, there's evidence that humans are doing more than just imitating actions, but imitating the result of an action, and specifically inferring intentions. So in one paper that was done in 2006, they showed that here's a human demonstrating a task, or actually failing to actually complete the task, and you'll see the infant that's 18 months old in this case is able to understand what the human wanted to do and help the human complete the task. And there were other scenarios of this as well. So in this example, the human clearly wants to use the pin to hang the towel. And the infant, even at 18 months, is able to understand the goal and able to help the human complete the task. And here's one last example of the human kind of giving a demonstration and actually failing to complete the task. And the infant is able to figure out the task. Okay, so how can we achieve this sort of intelligence in our agents? This sort of problem setup is generally known as inverse reinforcement learning, where you have some examples of the behavior that you want to achieve, and your goal is to infer the reward function or infer the objective, the intentions of the demonstrator. And this is actually a bit different than the example shown in the video. Usually in inverse reinforcement learning, you assume that you have behavior that is optimal or near optimal for the reward function that you're trying to infer. And then you're trying to infer that reward function and eventually learn the behavior. Yes?
But this assumes that the baby has seen successful attempts at the activity, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, these tasks are, I don't know, the baby probably hasn't seen someone trying to use a pin to hang a towel. They may have seen kind of high-level examples of stacking objects or moving things, but not these particular tasks. They probably have some sort of intuition about what the human is trying to achieve, though. And so one interesting direction is potentially on the frontiers, maybe for a class project, is trying to learn from kind of failed demonstrations rather than expert demonstrations. So one of the things that you'll learn about in this class is the kind of the formal setup of inverse reinforcement learning and how you can develop an algorithm for inverse reinforcement learning that infers the reward function of demonstrated behavior. And so some results that we did this year, this is me demonstrating a task with the PR2 robot, specifically putting a plate into a dish rack. And through an inverse reinforcement learning algorithm is able to infer the reward function of the task, and then successfully learn behavior using that inferred reward function. And so in this case, the reward function that it learned entails both being gentle with the plate and manipulating it slowly, as well as successfully completing the task. And we also have another example of pouring, like I showed before, where in this scenario, the cost function is more complex, because you don't you want to get to the cup and start pouring at the correct location. And so here's some of the learned behavior for this task. And actually, back to your question on evaluation, the way that we decided to evaluate this is we put almonds in the cup and we measured how many almonds ended up in the goal cup. Okay, so the second form of supervision that I mentioned before is prediction. And this is the idea that you can use basically observations that are the consequences of your actions as supervision, trying to predict, trying to learn what's called a model in reinforcement learning, which is the next observation conditioned on your current observation and your current action. And there's significant evidence, and a lot of people in neuroscience believe that humans are constantly predicting the consequences of our actions, and it's a central role in sensory motor control and in human cognition. And these sorts of studies actually started in the 1800s with Helmholtz, and they had these hypotheses have been around for quite a long time in neuroscience, and they're continuing to be studied in the brain. And so I guess the first thing to say about this is that if you have a perfect model of the environment, if you can perfectly predict what's going to happen next, given your current state and what action you take, then you can actually optimize for very complex behaviors. And for example, one thing that you can do with that is that you can simulate what could happen for any possible action that you take, and then pick the action that you like the best, or choose the action that will achieve the goal that you want to achieve. Or you can also optimize through that model. And so here's an example of some behavior learned with a perfect model of the environment. This is work by Jitan when he was at Georgia Tech. And they learned, here is the agent is cycling on bumps. Here is cycling down a set of stairs. And this sort of behavior is much more complex than is really currently capable of achieving in the real world. And it's very impressive. And the way that they achieve this behavior is using the simulation model of the world. Here's another example of hopping over curbs. And then I think after this there will be stunts. And this isn't the only example of using models. Another example is, there's a lot of examples of learning locomotion, learning other skills. Question?
Can you say that the model is perfect, meaning it's deterministic?
In this case, I believe it's a deterministic model. And so that certainly helps. But what I meant by perfect is that it knows exactly what's going to happen, and that it is, in this case, it is deterministic as well.
So it's differentiable, so you're learning that.
So oftentimes people don't use differentiable models. They might use finite differences to infer, but there are actually some cases in research where people use differentiable models. Okay, so one approach that people have taken in other domains where generally in the real world we don't have a perfect model, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, as well as there is going to be some sort of noise and stochasticity in what's going to happen. And generally you also don't have this nice low-dimensional representation of the world. You might just have your high-dimensional images that you're observing, or other sensory inputs that you're receiving. Do you have a question?
Yeah, those stunts there, what was the objective? Or what was the last function used? Was it imitating a human?
I'm not. Do you know?
It was complicated. So it was not imitation, but there was sort of a hand design objective for each of the stunts that sort of encoded what made the stunt.
Yeah.
Actually, what constituted success.
Yeah. So in the real world or in other scenarios, you don't want to assume access to a model, but what you can do instead is try and learn a model. So learn to predict what's going to happen. So here's some example by O et al. From Michigan, and here they learned a video prediction model. So on the right is the ground truth video, and on the left is the generated video from a deep neural network. And as you can see, it actually learns to predict the future in the scenario fairly accurately. If you look closely, there are some errors, not in Freeway, because Freeway is very cyclic and deterministic, but generally the results are very impressive. especially for these sorts of domains where the images are synthetic. Question.
So the image on the left is generated?
Yeah, the image on the video on the left is generated and rolled out. It's not doing one-step prediction, it's doing many-step prediction, conditioned on the initial image and the actions that the agent took. So this is one example, and some people have, so some work by me and some work by other people have looked at actually generating real videos with real images. And when you move to real images, things get a lot more interesting and a lot harder because you get more stochasticity in the environment, as well as much more complex scenes. So here on the top, on the left, we show the ground truth video, and on the right of each pair, we show the rolled out prediction, so conditioned again on the first frame and the sequence of actions. What is the future video going to look like? And you might notice that the predictions are a bit blurry. That's because the model, this is something that we'll go into later in the course. But in this case, the model represents its uncertainty as blur, and so therefore the predictions come out blurry. And then what we can do with this model is we can actually plan through the model and learn how to do very coarse actions. For example, here the goal was to push the water bottle slightly to the left. Here the goal is to rotate the bottle. We were able to learn some very coarse actions by just planning through this model once we had the model of the visual space. And so to finish up, the last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is auxiliary objectives and sensing modalities. So I don't know if this is something that we're going to touch on in great detail in this course, but I think it's something worth mentioning, is that there's many other sources of supervision that you can use to kind of aid your learning, especially if you're trying to learn some big neural network function and you're trying to learn the representation from the observations up. It's very helpful to have other forms of supervision beyond a reward function or beyond a demonstration that can aid that representation learning. And so some of the sources of supervision could be other sensing modalities like touch, audio, depth, if you have that information. So there's been some recent work by some folks at DeepMind, Morosky et al. And Yatterberg et al. On combining these sorts of auxiliary modalities to learn more efficiently. There's also learning multiple related tasks at the same time. And so if the tasks are related enough and need to share a representation, then that learning multiple tasks can hopefully aid in your representation learning. And lastly, if you know something about the task and you know just some properties of the world that are relevant to that task, then you can predict those properties, and that can also aid in representation learning. And so we'll first note that RL can be combined really with any of these forms of information. And so in this class, you'll be learning about, beyond reinforcement learning, which John covered, you'll be learning about imitation, inverse reinforcement learning, model-based control, as well as other ways to provide supervision. Sergey, do you have anything you'd like to add to close?
Okay, just one last question, one last comment. For those of you in this class or not in this class, this is sort of a deep reinforcement learning class with assignments and projects and so on. But actually, in parallel to this, there's also a seminar series on deep learning that I wanted to tell you about. That's going to be on Mondays at 1 p.m. Also in this room. That's CS 294-131. And this one is co-taught with Dawn Sung and Trevor Darrell. So if you're interested in deep learning topics, do check that out. It's sort of more of a lightweight kind of seminar series style class. And yeah, we'll see you all next week.